What is an equal protection bill, and how does it differ from other pro-life bills that have already passed in some states?
Yeah, so equal protection bill is a bill that just takes the existing laws that protect people's lives, right? We call those homicide laws, protect us from homicide like murder, and just says that, hey, those same laws that already protect born people also should protect people before they're born, because we're all equally made in the image of God. We all should all be equally protected.
And so I know some people who may be listening may think there are some states that are already abortion free. Why would you say that is not the case? And why would you say that an equal protection bill needs to be passed in order to make that the case?
Yeah, so there's no bill where there's been an equal protection bill passed. And the reason why that means those states are not abortion free is because in every single one of those states that many in the pro-life movement claim are abortion free, the clinics may be closed, or that is, they're not doing abortions, but they are not. Every single one of those bills says this does not apply to the mother, right? So abortion is illegal except for conduct committed by the mother. So the mothers can still order the abortion pills, possess the abortion pills, take the abortion pills in those states to murder their children in those states, and that's still totally legal, and they have express immunity under the pro-life legislation to do that.
Gotcha. One question on the equal protection bills that I had was whether they would address forms of birth control that could be possibly abortifacient. Do you have any insight on whether equal protection bills would do anything there?
So equal protection bills don't really deal with the methods, right, of how the lives are taken. So it doesn't deal with it doesn't deal specifically like with the abortion pill or surgical abortions or things like that. Just like homicide laws don't deal with homicide by gun, homicide by knife, homicide by poison, things like that. It's not really the method that is the issue. It's the act of taking another person's life, and then it's the intent. Did you intend to take that person's life? And without justification. That is, it's not a self-defense kind of situation or something like that. So as long as there's criminal intent there, and there is then a criminal action, going with that intent, then that is what that's what equal protection then would criminalize. So if someone is using something that is an abortifacient, and they know what they're doing, right? They know, because most abortifacients, they have different methods, right, or different kind of. So I'm trying to think of the right word, but stages, right? They're kind of first of all, they're trying to prevent fertilization, that's conception. But then they're also trying to prevent, then if that doesn't work, then they're trying to prevent implantation by thinning the lining of the uterine wall and preventing that already fertilized human being, or that already human being from implanting in the uterine wall. At that point, you are causing the death of a child. The issue then in the individual case would be, did that person know that that's what they were doing? Did they know that there was a child? Did they know that what they were doing was causing that child's death? If they did, right, then the bill would prohibit that. The bill would sanction that. If they did not, then the bill would not. Now, those who do know that that's how it works and that's what's going on are the people who are manufacturing these things. And so I think certainly there would be criminal liability for them, as a party to that.
Yeah, and I think another thing to note there as well is there would have to be proof of a victim, correct, in order to actually prosecute someone in this case. Because I know if it were preventing implantation, most of the time there wouldn't be any way to prove that there was actually a child conceived at that point, given our current state of technology in detecting early pregnancies. Am I correct in my understanding on that?
Yeah, as far as for individual cases, if there's never a corpus, we would say, right, or never a body, then yeah, you're not going to be able to prosecute for homicide. But there could be some cases that there ends up being that, right, that ends up happening, or it ends up that turns out it didn't work correctly, and this baby was actually injured, and then that company that knew that that's how it acted is in criminally liable for that. So the normal situation, though, there would be no evidence, that's what happened. And so it would be, on any individual case, it'd be hard to hold them liable. But I think the potential for liability, not just civil but criminal, is so large that I think most of those providers would say that, well, we're going to alter this to where it doesn't do that anymore. It doesn't intentionally prevent implantation, or they're going to take it off the shelves altogether.
Yeah. So I mean, to be clear, I definitely support the equal protection bills. I would say it could be appropriate, though, I think, to have some supplemental legislation in the meantime,
Right.
prior to our abilities to sort of detect life from fertilization, just to try to prevent people from, taking these drugs that could prevent implantation, as opposed to stopping fertilization if it's unable to prevent the fertilization. Do you think that'd be something that's reasonable to say, that we could have some supplemental legislation alongside something like an equal protection bill until we're able to get to that point where we can detect for life at fertilization?
I'd probably say the way that I would approach it is that it would be, I think supplemental could be great, but it would be after the fact, that it would be like, hey, first let's make it illegal to murder people, and then we can deal with kind of the edge cases, or the cases where people may be, supporting or encouraging or, supplying products that do that. Okay, then let's go after that. I think that'd be the best approach.
Yeah, that sounds fair. Another question I had is, what is the typical process for actually introducing these equal protection bills and potentially, getting them passed? Because I know for me, I'm not, super familiar with the intricacies of how you would actually go about, putting the bill forward to a congressperson to get them to advocate for in their state, and then ultimately get to the actual passage of that bill within a state, which I know that no state so far has passed one of these bills. But what would the actual process look like from a legislative perspective on how you actually get one of these bills passed?
Yeah, every state's a little bit different. There's a lot of that is the same. But as far as getting the bill filed in the first place, it just takes one legislator in a state to decide, to file the bill. What we do at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion is we help draft those bills initially, and then there's maybe grassroots, abolitionists in that state who then take that bill to the legislature and say, hey, this is what we'd like you to do, or maybe we're, communicating directly with the legislator themselves, and getting everything ready to file, and then the legislator, then once they're good with it, then they then file the bill, and then the bill in most states then gets assigned to a committee, and then it's up to the committee chair whether that bill gets a hearing, if the bill gets approved, or in some cases, even if it doesn't, it then can go on to the House floor, or if it's on the Senate side, the Senate floor. And if it passes that chamber, then it goes to the other. So if it passes the Senate, then it goes to the House, or if it passes the House, then it goes to the Senate. And then once you get it past both, then it then goes to the governor for the governor's signature. And assuming the governor signs it, then it becomes law. If the governor doesn't, if you have enough votes, you can override the governor's veto and make the bill a law that way.
Gotcha. Can you quickly go over sort of what happened in Louisiana for anyone who's sort of not familiar with what happened there? I know for me, that's kind of a case that sort of showed, what the hypocrisy that exists sort of in some segments of the pro-life movement, as far as viewing the mother who willingly gets the abortion as a second victim. So can you kind of just give a general overview of what occurred?
Yeah. So in 2022, we had helped prepare a bill of abolition there that was introduced. It was advocated for by many there in Louisiana, but kind of spearheaded by a pastor there, Brian Gunter, who met with and talked with Representative Danny McCormick, who loved it, and he introduced that and got a hearing on the bill. The committee that heard the bill then voted 7-2 in favor of the bill to approve it. So very wide margin, saying, yeah, let's approve this, let's do this. Then the next week, the bill was coming to the House floor for a vote, and a few hours, the same day, just a few hours before that bill was coming to a vote, 77 pro-life organizations sent a letter to the Louisiana legislature and all legislatures around the country, but it was obviously aimed, in that moment, primarily at Louisiana, urging them not to pass that legislation, not to pass equal protection legislation, with the claim, really the rationale is that women are victims of abortion, and so therefore we should not be criminalizing abortion as homicide in the same way that we criminalize the homicide of born people. that there should be unequal protection, basically, is what they were arguing for. And so that ended up, that convinced, I think, a lot of the legislators. There was actually even Pastor Gunter had done had called all the offices beforehand and done a count on whether the votes were there, and had talked with them all, and the votes were there to pass the bill until that pressure from the pro-life movement started coming, and then that letter then came, and that was kind of the end of it. So
Yeah,
then they ended up voting it down.
Yeah, so just to make sure I have this right, so it had reached the House floor for a vote. So if the House had voted in favor of it, it then would have gone to the Senate. If the Senate voted in favor of it, it would have gone to the governor. If the governor approved it, then it would have gone into law, correct?
Correct. That's right.
Okay. Is that the closest that an abolition bill has ever sort of gotten to being passed? Is it the only one that's made it out of committee so far? Or?
It's the only one that's made it to the floor of a chamber. Yeah, to the floor of the House or a Senate. Yep. Okay. I say that there have been some votes that have been taken on the floor of some, someone trying to amend or kind of bring the bill from committee and things like that. But as far as with committee approval, it's the first one that got to the House floor.
Are there any states that you think it's possible that a bill might make it to the House floor again, or might even make it, past the House, make it to the Senate or something like that in sort of the next year or two? Any states that look promising, or is it still looking sort of troubling?
I think there are. I think there's, we're expecting this year, there's already been 4 filed this year, but we're very early in the legislative kind of season. We're expecting as many as 20, maybe even 21 to be filed this year. So we're excited about that. There's always progress that's made because it opens up conversations, and it brings out your opposition, and people can kind of see them. And so even what happened in Louisiana was a giant step forward. Although the bill itself died, it was a giant step forward for abolition, as it exposed the position of a lot of the pro-life establishment that they actually oppose equal protection. So that was a big step forward. But anyways, that said, I do think that it will get to the floor somewhere this session. I'm not ready yet to say where that is. We don't want to necessarily tip everybody off where that is quite yet, but I do think that it will hopefully get somewhere this session, and hopefully eventually everywhere.
Yeah. I'm just curious. I know this part is probably a lot of speculation, but once a abolition bill or a bill of equal protection does pass, or if a bill of equal protection does pass, I'm assuming and I'm expecting that there's going to be significant amount of scrutiny, and that state's essentially going to be under a microscope to see sort of how the bill works, right? If there's instances where people are being denied miscarriage care or something like that, if anything like that is occurring, obviously it's going to be probably widely reported. So I'm just curious, sort of how you're thinking about that. Like once one of these bills does pass, sort of what would be like the next few months after that happens?
Yeah, it's certainly there will be false narratives going on, right? We see that even with existing pro-life legislation, how pro-abortion movement says that it's women are dying and things like that, and it's keeping doctors from providing care, and it's not. That's all that's written into the bills to allow for that the necessary care that happens. Same thing even in our bill, explicitly, like on the subject of miscarriage, it says it doesn't apply to miscarriage. And so I expect that there will be a lot of lies flying around, people trying to discredit it, that we'll have to deal with it with the truth, like we always have. And but yeah, I expect that will happen.
Yeah, because the way that I see it is, if one of these bills does pass, it's going to be under a microscope. There'll certainly be a lot of scrutiny, but I could also see a scenario where it passes. You get past 6 months or a year of it being scrutinized by the media, and other states look around that are already largely conservative, largely pro-life, maybe not abolitionist, but pro-life, and they see that these bills aren't the crazy thing they were made out to be, and then you could possibly then end up getting a domino effect where you get some other states that are largely conservative, have pro-life majorities in Congress, that then start passing these bills. So that would be something that I'd be looking for if one of these bills does pass in one state, is if you actually get that domino effect where you get these other states that then pass them as well.
Yeah, I think so. I think once one state passes it, it's going to make it exponentially easier to get that second state, and then once two states, and then so on. It's going to be a big watershed to get that first state.
Yeah, for sure. So one other thing that you do is you are associated with Heritage Defense, correct?
Right. Yep.
And so can you explain a little bit sort of what Heritage Defense is and what you do over there?
Yeah. So I'm the vice president and general counsel at Heritage Defense. So it's kind of another hat that I wear as an attorney, in addition to kind of being attorney on abolishing abortion. I've been with Heritage Defense since we launched it in 2010, and it's to defend parental rights of Christian families. As they may come under attack, as they may come under any kind of false allegation of abuse or neglect or things like that. That's what we protect at Heritage Defense. And so I'm the vice president and general counsel here.
Yeah, one of the things that I found really interesting, sort of on the Heritage Defense website, and I guess just in general, is the I forget what it's called, but essentially the document that you guys have for the different states as far as information that parents should be aware of. I took a look at the state I'm in. I'm not a parent, but I just found it interesting, which is Michigan. And I thought it was very helpful. So I would recommend that people take a look there. It's free as far as I can tell, though I think you've got to, give the email or whatever. But one question that I had for you is, let's say that instead of me being young and not having kids, I was, say, 30 years old, had a couple kids, wanted to start homeschooling them. What are things that I should be aware of as I sort of was to start that journey?
Yeah, well, you're talking about our law and policy vault, which people can get access to for free, and that has dozens of issues, parental rights issues, and the laws in those states for all 50 states. That kind of, you're a parent, then, what do you need to know? Some of it's just kind of very basic stuff that you don't even really realize until you're a parent. It's just like, wait, what kind of car seat does my child have to be in? And okay, well, where does that car seat have to go? And, things like that. And really, actually, there's a lot of things that we have on our law and policy vault that began right at birth. Laws about vaccines right at birth, hepatitis B vaccine, especially eye ointment, erythromycin eye ointment that's often done, or silver nitrate they used to do, or laws about the newborn screenings that they do. They do a hearing screening. They do a blood test that's sent into the government checking for genetic disorders. All of those things that there are laws around in almost every state, they begin right there at birth. And there's ways, to opt out of different things of that. And, I'm not saying all parents need to do all that, but it's good to know what you can do and what you can't do and what the limits are and how to do that. And so all that begins right at birth. And then, then you kind of move on to car seat laws, or like, oh, I'm out with my child, I need to run into the store real fast, kind of leave them in the car for a minute. What's the law on that? All those sorts of things you start to encounter as a parent, that laws that you've never had to really think about before. And a whole lot more of them, but those are just a few.
Yeah, one question I had was specifically about education, right? So for homeschooling parents, for Christians who are homeschooling their kids, is there things that they need to be specifically concerned about, or things they need to look at specifically in terms of what the law is in order to protect themselves from something like a CPS report or a CPS investigation?
Yeah, so when it comes to laws about, how to homeschool, or how to comply with government, the homeschool laws, that's definitely something, if families are considering homeschooling, that they will want to check into that, because every state is a little bit different about how to comply with that. Some states some states you can just take your children out of the public school or never send them in the first place, and that's it. You educate them, and you don't have to make reports or notices or things like that. And that's called freedom, which is great. Other states have less of that freedom thing, and so you have to, may have to notify the government, and you may have to provide annual reports, and some states even testing, things like that. So we do encourage folks to check that out. kind of complying with those homeschool laws is not something that's really within our scope at Heritage Defense, but it's something that our friends at HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association, have done a great job of for decades. And so that would be where we point people. And it's one reason why many of our members of Heritage Defense are also members of HSLDA, just so they kind of cover all their bases, their right to homeschool, and then with us, all their other parental rights as they may come under attack.
Gotcha. So, like, again, consider, like, say I was 30-year-old, had kids.
Yeah.
What would be the most likely reason that someone from my family or I could get reported to CPS? I'm assuming you've probably done some research on, what are the most common CPS reports, and sort of what the process is there.
Yeah, so the most common, you have, well, first of all, just so people know, when we're talking about these things, generally when someone's arrested for something, you kind of think that they probably did it, right? Because most of the time they did. When it comes to CPS cases and being accused of child abuse or child neglect, it's actually the opposite. According to their own data nationally, you can go look this up at Federal Department of Health and Human Services, Child Protective Services agencies nationwide, over 90% of reports that come into CPS are ultimately deemed by themselves to be unfounded, and yet they end up investigating most of those, and over 83% of investigations are deemed unfounded. So just because someone has a CPS investigation going on doesn't mean that they're child abusers. In fact, it's the opposite. More than 4 out of 5 families who are investigated are not abusing their children, or even neglecting their children, which is a much lower standard. And so, unfortunately, there's tons of children that are being investigated and kind of traumatized through these interviews unnecessarily, and through the whole process. And over 37%, studies show over 37% of children in the U.S. will be part of a CPS investigation by the time they turn 18. So back to your question, kind of where's the main place that these are coming from? Well, we've created these mandatory reporters in all 50 states that we say that there are certain professions that are legally required to report any kind of suspicion of child abuse or neglect. Which we say, okay, well, hey, that's not bad, right? We want to protect kids. It's like, well, the problem is by mandating it, right? We don't actually mandate reporting other crimes, but people do report them because it's the right thing to do. But we mandate it, and it ends up resulting in major over-reporting, and that ends up, leading to what we're talking about, over 90% unfounded. So the top 2 sources of that are school personnel and law enforcement. So law enforcement community and school personnel are the top 2 sources of reports. The third most common is the medical community. So doctors and nurses and hospital staff are the third most common kind of source of report and I would say in all those cases not in all cases, but in all those categories, number 1 sources of false reports as well.
Gotcha. And I'm assuming that the reasoning why someone who is underneath the mandatory reporting requirement would be inclined to err on the side of reporting rather than not is because I'm assuming if they didn't report and it was discovered that they had some sort of indication that something was going on, then they could be held professionally or civilly liable, I'm assuming, correct?
And even criminally liable, yes. So it's actually, in fact, in every case where there's mandatory report, it's actually a criminal. If you do not report, then you can be held criminally liable. And then also you lose your license to practice whatever it is that you're practicing. And of course that goes on your record and makes it hard to get a job. And then there's even some states, yes, where there's also civil liability that you as the person who failed to report are now actually liable for this child's injuries, even though you had nothing to do with them. And so tremendous pressure to report. So that's why in the medical community, we even see lots of hospitals, adopting policies. I'm sure there are lawyers telling them, being good lawyers trying to protect their clients. They're telling them like, hey, just adopt policies that just, when in doubt, you report. And so hospitals have policies that say if a child has more than 1 recent injury, automatic report, even if there's no actual suspicion of child abuse or neglect. If a child under 2 years old has a suspected head injury, automatic report. and if a child has an oblique or spiral fracture, automatic report. So they have policies like that in place, and that ends up resulting in a whole lot of over-reporting. In addition to just the ones that they're just like, I don't think there's abuse here, but I'm gonna report it. Like one story, we had a mom that she was at the park walking with her children, and she had their I think it was 8-month old, that she was holding, and she slipped and fell and tried to cradle him to keep him from hitting his head as they fell. Fell into the gravel. She's pretty sure that he didn't hit his head, but she wanted to be sure. So she went to the hospital, got him checked out. Hospital said everything looks great, no injury. And she said, okay, great. Can we go now? And it's like, yeah, you can go, but just want to let you know we are reporting this to Child Protective Services. It's like, wait, well, why? It's like, well, because we have a policy if a child has, a baby has a suspected head injury, then we report it to CPS. It's like, yeah, but you ruled out that there wasn't a head injury. It's like, yes, but there was a suspected head injury. And so they reported it, even though they didn't have any suspicion that she was a bad mom at all. In fact, she'd gone above and beyond taking care of her baby, but got reported to CPS because of that.
Yeah, and I mean, even if someone believes mandatory reporting laws are a good thing, which I'd say, at this point, I probably don't have a position on it, but maybe even I'd say at this point, I'm probably even inclined to still say that mandatory reporting could be good policy, even though I probably haven't looked into it. It would still make sense that in a world where mandatory reporting is required, or even in a world where it's not, that people would want to understand the laws in their state to best protect themselves and their families, and also understand what to do in an unfortunate circumstance where there is a false report or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Whatever your position on mandatory reporting laws, they 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 result in a lot of unfounded reports, and so you may be a fantastic family, but the likelihood, there's, like I said, over one in three children will be part of CPS investigation by the time they turn 18, and that's not just from a study. Even the Federal Department of Health and Human Services says in 1 year, more than one out of every four children, or I'm sorry, not one out of every 4%, 4% of children in America are part of a CPS investigation in 1 year. So of all the children in America, 4%. Well, that's just 1 year. So you can see very quickly by the time a child gets to 18 how 37% is not that difficult.
What would be the process for an investigation? So like in an example where, someone takes their child to the hospital for something, there's a mandatory report, even though the doctors don't necessarily think it's a high likelihood that there was actual abuse or neglect or something like that, but there's a mandatory report that goes through. What would the actual process look like on the parents' end if they are reported under one of those laws?
Yeah, so typically, if there's really genuine concerns, then you're not even going to be able to get out of the hospital and get home. So the cases we're talking about is where there's not real abuse there, but there's enough there that the doctors feel like they need to go ahead and report just to cover themselves. So typically the parents are going to be getting a knock on the door from a social worker that works with the Department of Family and Protective Services or Department of Family and Children's Service or whatever it is in their state, but Child Protective Services, CPS, will be knocking on their door, and they will be normally wanting to do at least three things. They're wanting to talk with both parents separately, make sure their stories line up, and then they're wanting to come into the home and do a home inspection, go through the entire home, and especially looking in pantries and fridge and freezers and making sure there's adequate food and running water and things like that. Even if that has zero to do with the allegations, they still want to do all those sorts of things. Make sure if there are guns in the home, they're locked up and stuff like that. And then they want to interview they want to take each of the children privately outside the presence of their parents, outside the presence of their siblings, and interview them and do what they call a global interview. That is not just about the actual allegations themselves, but really about safety in general. Do you have any concerns? Do you know where people aren't supposed to touch you? All those kind of things, part of the global interview that they want to ask children privately. And So that when they're knocking at the door, those are normally the three things they want: interview with parents, home inspection, and then private interviews with children.
And so should parents be concerned about allowing any of those three? Do they have to allow all of those three or any of those, or?
They're not legally required to allow those things unless they have a court order, unless the social worker has a court order. Which, if the parent just says no, not interested, go away, slams the door in their face, then they may go get a court order and come back then with law enforcement to then enforce that. And so, each situation is different about the best way to navigate that. It's always, you obviously want to assure them that you're a good parent, that your children aren't being abused or neglected. But you also want to do so in a way that, that you minimize the trauma to your children. And sometimes these conversations can be defiling, asking them about things that it's not really appropriate, especially oftentimes for homeschooled children who may have not been exposed to a lot of these things. And not that parents haven't talked to them about it, but maybe not in quite the way that the CPS worker will. And so it can be very, very scary. There's even studies that show that these interviews with children and just having this government agent coming into their home, interrogating them about their family life, in kind of intimate aspects of their family life, is itself traumatic to children and harmful to children. And so there are certainly cases where that's appropriate, where the government has jurisdiction and they need to do that in order to protect children. But sometimes that the actual investigation itself is the most harmful thing that's been done to children who their parents haven't abused or neglected them. So the investigation itself is then harmful, and so that's what we do then is we then protect those parents' rights, help them navigate that situation to assure and provide CPS enough to show that, hey, the children are not being abused or neglected here, but they're doing so in a way that minimizes the stress and trauma to the family.
Awesome. And do you guys have a guide sort of beyond the state by state requirements, just as far as, questions that parents are probably going to have maybe after watching this, or even if they don't watch this, but they just think about, what would I do if CPS showed up at my door? What would be the best precautions to take and the way to sort of conduct themselves and help their families and protect their families, in the most appropriate and responsible way possible? Are there any resources they should take a look at?
Yeah, they can go to our website at heritagedefense.org. We have some resources on that specifically. And then, as far as information about heritagedefense.org, I think it's heritagedefense.org/learn or learn more, or there's a button like that they can click and find out more about kind of what we do and how we help families.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me, Bradley.
Yeah, thanks for having me.